The wind tore across the high country like a whip, dragging the snow sideways in bitter sheets. Elaine Rosewood stumbled through it, her thin shawl clutched tight, though it might as well have been cobweb for all the warmth it gave. The hem of her dress was stiff with ice, the color drained from her cheeks. Her shoes, worn thin by miles of stone and frost, let in the cold with every step until her toes no longer burned but felt like wood. She had been walking since dawn, and now the sun was gone, lost behind thick clouds that turned the sky into a flat, merciless gray. She should have died already. That thought rattled in her head as if it belonged to someone else. Every breath seared her lungs, every step bent her body lower. Her husband's people had cast her out 3 days before, after his body was laid in the ground, saying she was nothing but another mouth to feed, no dowry, no claim, no place. She remembered their voices, sharp as knives, useless. Oh wait. They had left her at the edge of the trail, and she had wandered toward the mountains because the town roads were worse, filled with men who measured her with hungry eyes or spat in the snow at her passing. The snow deepened at her knees. Her legs gave out and she fell to her hands, the cold biting through the skin like needles. She tried to rise but her arms trembled, refusing to hold her. The world tilted and blurred. She pressed her forehead into the whiteness, lips stiff as she whispered, "The snow will kill me." The words broke like glass, weak and final, carried off by the wind. A shadow fell across her. For a moment she thought it was death, come to take her. Then rough hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her, hauling her upright. She blinked, forcing her eyes open against the storm. A man loomed above her, broad-shouldered, his coat lined with thick pelts, snow crusting his beard. His gaze was as steady as the mountains behind him, dark eyes narrowed against the gale. Jedediah McGraw said nothing at first. He studied the fragile figure half buried in the snow, the face pale, lips blue, the hands raw and torn. He could leave her, he thought of it, just for a heartbeat. Every pound of weight meant less food, less warmth, less chance for his own survival. But there was something in the way she had curled into herself, a woman with no fight left, that struck a place in him he thought long dead. He slid his fur cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around her. The sudden weight of it pressed her down, yet heat spread slowly through the cloth, shocking her enough to gasp. His voice came low, roughened by years alone in the high country. "No one deserves to die like this." Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came, only a faint whimper. He bent, lifted her as if she weighed no more than a child, and carried her against his chest. She sagged into him, her head dropping against his coat. He began the slow climb through drifts toward the dark line of pines where his cabin stood hidden. The storm howled louder, as if unwilling to surrender her. Snow stung his eyes, but Jed pressed on, boots crunching through ice. She was nearly gone, her breath shallow, her body limp. Still, he muttered under his breath, not to her but to the emptiness, "You'll see fire yet, girl. Hold to that." By the time they reached the cabin, night had fallen hard. The log walls stood squat against the storm, smoke curling faint from the chimney where embers had been banked before he left to check his traps. He kicked the door open, ducked inside, and shut out the blizzard with a slam. The sudden stillness pressed on his ears. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and dried meat. A lantern hung from the rafters, throwing a dim glow over the rough-hewn table, the stacked firewood, the rifle leaning by the hearth. He lowered her onto the bed, his bed the only one, and pulled the furs tighter around her. She shivered still, her lips gray. He worked quickly, setting kindling in the hearth, striking flint until sparks caught. Flames flared, throwing orange light against the log walls. Heat pushed back the chill, though slowly. He poured water from the kettle, warmed it, held it to her lips. She drank weakly, eyes fluttering open. She tried to sit but failed, too weak. Her voice rasped, little more than breath. Why would you?" Jed cut her off, not harsh but final. "Rest." She stared at him, frightened still. In town, men who offered aid often demanded something in return. But this one only set bread by her side and stepped back. He pulled a chair to the corner and sat, watching the fire, not her. Elaine turned her face away, cheeks burning despite the cold. Shame pricked her, shame for needing rescue, shame for the ruin her life had become. Yet a spark flickered in her chest, a fragile, painful hope. Jed did not ask her name nor offer his. He simply kept the fire alive, adding logs when it waned, silent as stone. His thoughts drifted to the small wooden cross buried outside under the snow. He did not look at it now. He had no use for graves, only for what could still live. Hours passed before her trembling eased. When she finally slept, her breathing steadier, Jed allowed himself to relax, though only slightly. He leaned back in the chair, eyes never leaving the flames. Outside, the storm beat against the cabin walls, relentless. Inside, the fire burned on, stubborn, defiant. He wondered what kind of woman was cast out to freeze in the mountains. Her hands bore the softness of one not raised to chop wood or snare rabbits. Yet there was a fierce endurance in the way she had clung to life. Most would have lain down long before. He did not understand her story, nor did he need to, not yet. Morning would bring questions and perhaps answers. For now there was only survival. As the night deepened, Jed rose, drew another pelt over her sleeping form and returned to his chair. He thought of the silence he had lived with these past years, the quiet broken only by wolves, by wind, by his own breath. Now the cabin held another heartbeat. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. He stared at the fire until his eyes grew heavy. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls the glow held. Somewhere in the night, she murmured in her sleep, a sound like pleading. He almost moved to wake her, but stopped, knowing some battles a soul must fight alone. At last, he let the flames be his guard and closed his eyes, the words he had spoken in the snow still echoing inside him. No one deserves to die like this. The storm would not last forever. Neither would the silence. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as sharp and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. When Elaine first opened her eyes to the pale light creeping through the shutter cracks, she thought she had woken in some other world. The cabin was warm, the fire still alive, and the mountain man sat at the table sharpening his knife with patient strokes. He glanced up, gave a single nod, then returned to his blade. No words of comfort, no questions, only the sound of steel on stone. She tried to rise, stiff from sleep, the furs sliding from her shoulders. The shame of being wrapped in another man's belongings seared her, but hunger pressed harder. Bread sat on the table, coarse and hard as rock, but she ate it as though it were feast day cake. He didn't speak as she chewed, only pushed a tin cup of water toward her. When the silence stretched too long, she forced herself to ask, voice trembling, "What will you have me do?" Jedediah McGraw set the knife aside, met her gaze with eyes unreadable. "Work what you can. Leave what you can't." Then he stood, pulling on his coat, and went out into the blizzard without another word. That first day alone, she moved through the cabin, feeling like a thief. She tried to split wood with the hatchet by the hearth, but her hands, more used to needle and thread than axe and timber, blistered quickly. The blade struck wrong, biting into the ground. Frustration brought tears, hot against the cold air seeping through the gaps in the wall. By evening she had managed only a few rough logs, barely enough to keep the fire burning. When Jed returned, arms laden with rabbit and kindling, he looked at the pathetic pile of wood and then at her torn hands. He said nothing, only took her palms in his rough fingers, studied the blisters, then set them gently back on her lap. He mended the fire himself, skinned the rabbits, and left her to stew in the silence. That night, she whispered to herself in the dark, "I am not useless." The words felt fragile, but she clung to them. The next morning she rose before him, determined to prove she was worth more than pity. She tried cooking the rabbit meat, but smoke filled the cabin and the stew turned bitter. When he tasted it, his face gave nothing away, though she caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He ate every bite without complaint, and only when she turned her face did she let herself smile. The days rolled on in this manner, her fumbling through work, his quiet corrections, the silence stretching between them like a rope that might snap or draw them closer. She found she began to notice the details of him, the way his hands never wasted movement, the way his boots carried years of wear yet never faltered, the way his eyes softened when he looked at the fire as though it carried memories too heavy to speak. Her chance to show strength came sooner than expected. One evening, the distant howl of a wolf split the night. The sound crept under her skin, dragging old fears with it. She moved toward the bed, pulling the fur around her, but the howl came again, closer this time, circling the cabin. Jed reached for his rifle without hesitation. He stepped outside, the door banging shut behind him. She froze, debating whether to follow. Her heart hammered, but some stubborn spark pushed her toward the window. She caught sight of him, a lone figure standing in the snow, rifle raised, facing the gray shape slinking at the tree line. The wolf's eyes glowed with hunger, daring him. But when it saw another shape, hers, at the window, it hesitated. Jed fired into the air, the crack splitting the silence, and the beast fled back into the pines. He returned, brushing snow from his shoulders, and found her still at the window, trembling but upright. "You stood," he said simply, setting the rifle aside. For the first time, there was something like respect in his tone. She sank into the chair, breathless, but inside her chest burned a new warmth, not from the fire but from his words. It was at the trading post weeks later that she learned how small mercies were often measured by cruel tongues. Jed had brought her along, kneading flour and bullets, and she walked at his side, eyes down. Whispers chased her the moment she entered. Men muttered behind their hands, some laughing, others leering. Widow found herself a warm bed, one said loud enough to sting. Another spat on the floor, calling her abandoned stock. Her cheeks flamed, her fists clenched. She wanted to shout that they were wrong, that she had earned her place beside the mountain man. But her throat closed and shame flooded her. She turned away, pretending to examine a jar of beans. Jed's silence filled the space, heavier than any word. His presence, looming and unshakable, forced the others to step back. When he paid and let her out, not one dared block the door. On the trail back, she dared a glance at him. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed ahead. "They see what they want," he said at last, his voice gravel in the cold air. "Truth's not theirs to hold." That night, when she washed her face in the water trough outside, she caught her reflection. The ice fractured her image into shards, jagged and incomplete. She stared until her breath fogged the surface, erasing it. For the first time she did not look away. In the weeks that followed, Elaine found small ways to carve herself into the life they shared. She stitched his torn coat sleeve with the neat precision her mother had once praised. She patched his worn gloves, her needle moving steady even when her fingers numbed. When he found the coat mended, he said nothing, but she noticed he wore it the next day. Each act became its own kind of defiance against the voices that had called her useless. She began to rise earlier, to chop more wood, to cook meals that grew less bitter with each attempt. Jed watched her with the same steady silence, though once, when she dropped a log squarely onto the chopping block, clean and sure, she thought she saw his mouth curve into something close to a smile. Still, the shame from town lingered, festering like a wound. She wondered if he had taken her in out of charity, or worse, if he too thought of her as burden. At night she listened to the storm clawing at the shutters and imagined the words she longed to ask. "Why did you save me?" But she never spoke them. Instead, she let the fire speak, its warmth steady between them, its light casting shadows that seemed to draw them together as much as it kept them apart. One evening, after a day of endless wind and gray skies, she set a plate of bread before him, harder than stone but made with her own hands. He broke it, chewed, and met her eyes. "Better," he said. Just one word, but it lodged in her chest like a brand. She turned away quickly so he would not see her tears. They were not of shame this time, but of something else, something she did not yet have the courage to name. The snow outside deepened, burying the world in silence. Inside the cabin, small acts of survival stitched them closer, thread by thread, though neither spoke of it. And in that silence, something unspoken began to take root, fragile but alive, like the first green shoot waiting beneath the frozen earth. The snow had begun to crust over, the storms easing though the cold clung like a second skin. Elaine had grown accustomed to the rhythm of cabin life, each day marked by the chopping of wood, the mending of gear, the fire never left to fade. She had learned to carry her share of the work without waiting for Jed's direction. He said little still, but in his silence she sensed something shifting, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was no longer a guest but part of the place. It was on one of their trips down to the settlement that the trouble showed its teeth. The trading post was crowded with men, their coats damp with melting frost, the air heavy with pipe smoke and the tang of whiskey. Elaine kept close to Jed, the memory of cruel whispers still fresh, her eyes lowered as they stepped inside. Near the counter stood Silas Crowder, a rancher whose name carried weight in the valley. He had money, land, and a reputation for taking what he wanted. His gaze fixed on Elaine the moment she entered. A slow smile curled beneath his mustache. "Well now," he drawled loud enough for all to hear, "looks like McGraw found himself a companion to keep the nights from getting too long." A ripple of laughter followed. Jed's jaw tightened but he gave no answer, setting flour and powder on the counter with calm deliberation. Elaine's cheeks burned, her chest tightening with the same helpless shame that had haunted her since the day she'd been cast out. Crowder stepped closer, eyes never leaving her. "A widow, ain't you? I heard tell of a young woman tossed out after her man died in the mines. Shame that. You do better on a proper spread than wasting away in a hunter's shack." Jed's hand closed around the sack of flour, knuckles pale. Still he held his tongue, his silence heavier than any threat. When his dark gaze finally lifted to Crowder's, the laughter died in the room. He paid, lifted his bundle, and steered Elaine toward the door. No words passed between them until the horse's hooves struck snow again. "They'll keep talking," he said at last, his voice roughened by more than the cold. Words are wind. Let them blow past. She nodded, though inside the shame burned hotter. She hated that she had no defense but his silence, hated that she was seen as little more than a body in a man's care. The days after were heavy with that weight, yet life demanded they move forward. When a storm broke hard across the ridge, a neighbor came pounding on the door, his face white with fear. His boy Tommy had gone out in the gale and not returned. Jed cursed under his breath, pulling on his coat, readying to go. But it was Elaine who saw the small figure staggering in the snow near the tree line. Jed, there? Without thinking, she ran into the storm, skirts whipping, boots sinking deep. The boy collapsed just as she reached him, his lips blue, his small frame trembling. She gathered him in her arms, her body burning with cold, and half-dragged, half-carried him back to the cabin. Jed was there to take the boy from her arms, laying him by the fire while she tore off her wet shawl, pressing warmth into the child with her own body heat. Through the long night they worked side by side, feeding the boy broth, wrapping him in pelts, coaxing life back into his fragile body. When at last he breathed steady, Jed turned to her. His eyes held something new, something weighty. You saved him, he said, the words plain but carrying a depth that struck her. Elaine felt it in her chest, a swelling she could not name. For once she did not feel like a burden but a shield. The shift between them grew in the days that followed. Jed's silence was softer, almost companionable, as though the walls between them had thinned. Once, by the fire, his hand brushed hers when he passed her a tin cup. Neither pulled away at once, and in that brief touch she felt a truth clearer than any spoken vow. Still nothing was said. Their bond was forged not in words but in the small acts of care they gave each other. But peace in the mountains never lasted long. Silas Crowder came again, riding up the ridge with 2 armed men. Their horses stamped outside the cabin, breath steaming in the cold. Jed stepped out, rifle in hand, while Elaine stood just inside the door, heart pounding. Crowder leaned on his saddle horn, eyes gleaming. Word is you've been squatting too long, McGraw. Land's shifting to my hands one way or another. You'll pay what's owed, or you'll be gone before spring. Jed's voice was calm, flat. I owe nothing. The rancher's smile widened. You've got a woman under your roof now. Makes a man weaker, easier to bend. Best think on it. Elaine's fists tightened. She wanted to hide, to shrink back as she had in the trading post, but anger rose instead. Before she could think, she stepped forward, her voice sharp as the wind. You'll not take this home. Not while I stand here. The men's laughter burst out, mocking, but Jed's head turned toward her. For the first time she saw his eyes flash not just with anger at Crowder, but with pride at her defiance. Crowder's face hardened. He tugged his reins, signaling his men. We'll be back, he promised, voice low. And next time it won't be talk. They rode off, hooves kicking snow. The silence they left behind felt heavier than gunpowder. Jed lowered his rifle but did not move inside at once. He stared down the trail long after the riders were gone, his breath hanging in the frozen air. Elaine watched him, her own chest tight with fear and something fiercer. She knew now the danger was not just the storm or the hunger of wolves, but men who carved power with greed and guns. When Jed finally turned, his eyes met hers. They'll come, he said, voice steady. She nodded. Then we'll be ready. The fire behind them glowed through the cabin's window, its light spilling onto the snow. In its reflection, Elaine saw not the helpless widow she had once been, but a woman standing unbroken at a man's side, ready to fight for a place she now called her own. Night laid its hand heavy upon the mountains. The air outside the cabin was sharp, brittle, carrying the hush before violence. Inside, Elaine set another log upon the fire, watching sparks leap, each one a fragile prayer against the dark. Jed sat across from her, oiling his rifle with the same calm he carried in every task, though his eyes betrayed what his hands did not. They both knew Crowder would come. Men like him did not make empty threats. Elaine's heart hammered, not from fear of death but from the knowledge that the life she had built here, fragile and hard-won, might be ripped away before it had even settled roots. She remembered the woman she had been weeks before, a cast-off, hunched against the storm, ready to surrender to the snow. That woman was gone. Whatever came tonight, she would not cower. The first sound was faint, a crunch of hooves in the frozen earth. Then voices, low and cruel, carried on the wind. Jed rose, slinging the rifle across his shoulder, and looked to her. No speech, no reassurance, only a quiet nod. She returned it, her hand steady as she tightened the shawl about her shoulders. The door rattled under a hard fist. McGraw. Crowder's voice, thick with whiskey and arrogance, broke through the night. Come out or we'll smoke you out like vermin. Jed opened the door himself, stepping into the cold. Elaine stood just inside the threshold, the fire behind her throwing her shadow tall against the wall. The moon broke through the clouds, silvering the snow, revealing Crowder and his 2 men astride their horses, rifles gleaming in the pale light. You've had your chance, Crowder said, smiling wide. Last warning. The land's mine. Walk away and maybe I'll let you keep the woman. His gaze slid to Elaine, lingering like a hand she could not shake off. Jed leveled the rifle, his voice flat. This land's not for sale. Nor the woman. The rancher laughed, the sound harsh and empty. Then his hand lifted and the night erupted. Gunfire split the air. Bullets tore splinters from the cabin walls. Jed fired back, dropping one rider with a shot clean through the chest. The man toppled into the snow, his blood spreading crimson over white. Elaine's breath caught, her body frozen, but then instinct roared through her. She grabbed the spare rifle from the wall, hands trembling at first, then steadying as she braced it against her shoulder. Crowder's second man charged forward, pistol blazing. Jed swung to meet him but stumbled as a bullet grazed his side. The mountain man went down to one knee, teeth clenched against the pain. The gunman raised his weapon for the killing shot. Elaine fired. The crack of her rifle echoed against the pines. The man jerked back, blood blossoming on his coat, and fell lifeless into the drift. Smoke curled from the barrel in her hands. She stared at it, heart hammering, the enormity of what she had done coursing through her like fire. Crowder roared in fury. He dismounted, striding forward with a knife glinting in his hand. You think you've won? He spat. You'll both rot out here. Jed staggered to his feet, blood seeping through his coat, but still he lifted his rifle, ready to fight to the last breath. Yet before he could act, Elaine stepped between them. She leveled her weapon again, her voice clear, unwavering. No, she said. Not this home. Not this life. The words struck sharper than any bullet. For the first time, Crowder faltered, reading in her eyes the truth, that she was no man's burden, no discarded widow, but a woman forged by snow and fire. His sneer twisted, pride refusing surrender. He lunged. The shot rang out, louder than the storm that followed. Crowder collapsed into the snow, his knife falling from lifeless fingers. Silence swept over the ridge, broken only by the hiss of wind through the trees. Elaine lowered the rifle slowly, her arms trembling not from weakness but from release. Jed caught her before she could sway, his hand firm despite the blood soaking his side. Their eyes met, and in that gaze everything unspoken was laid bare. The nights of silence, the small mercies, the unyielding bond carved by hardship. You saved me, he whispered, voice ragged. Thought the snow would take you. But you saved me. Her hand pressed to his wound, steady as stone. We saved each other, she answered. They moved together, dragging Crowder's body into the pines, the snow swallowing the red trail behind them. The other men lay where they fell, claimed by the mountain. There would be whispers in town, rumors carried by tongues eager for scandal, but here, under the weight of the stars, none of that mattered. Back inside, she bound his wound with strips of linen, her fingers sure despite the shaking that came after the fight. Jed sat still, watching her work, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. When she finished, he reached for the fur cloak he had once wrapped around her in the storm. He laid it across her shoulders again, not as charity but as claim, as belonging. Neither spoke of love. They did not need to. It was there in the silence, in the warmth of shared breath, in the firelight flickering against the log walls. By dawn the storm had passed. The snow outside glistened under a pale sun, covering the blood, smoothing the scars of the night. Elaine stepped into it, the cold biting her cheeks, and for the first time she did not fear it. She bent to scatter seeds in the thawing earth near the cabin, her hands firm, her resolve unbroken. Life would come again even here. Jed joined her, moving slower from his wound, but standing tall beside her. Together they watched smoke rise from the chimney, curling into the clear sky. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the valley. Elaine drew the fur close, the rifle heavy in her hands, and let her gaze rest on the mountains. Once she had believed the snow would kill her. Now she knew better. The snow had remade her. And as the fire burned behind them, steady and unyielding, the future stretched wide before their feet, hard, uncertain, but theirs.